Vanakkam, Namaste, Salam Alaikum to all of you present here. And thank you for registering for this webinar. I hope at the end of the webinar you do have something substantial to take home with you and to apply to your classrooms in the near future. So let's look at the title, Teaching Learning Strategies in Second Language Acquisition. Now, why did I focus on teaching learning strategies? Why did I separate them just with a slash? Why didn't I say teaching and learning strategies? Or why didn't I just focus only on teaching strategies? Why didn't I focus only on learning strategies? The reason being, teaching and learning strategies are intricately woven together. They are inseparable. So, only if the teacher adopts or adapts the right teaching strategies, in turn, he or she can inculcate or facilitate the right learning strategies in learners. Now look at this cartoon here. Look at this joke here. Well, this is an example of a classroom management strategy. So the teacher wanted to keep her class quiet, and she told her students that the glue sticks were lip balm, and on applying it, they all turned very quiet. So, why exactly do we need such teaching strategies? Of course, not like these, jokes apart. Why do you need teaching strategies? This is the present situation. Look at the comparison in situations between 1967 and the present day. In those days, parents and teachers held an upper hand. The teacher always was considered right. So if the grades were bad, the parents questioned the children. Why haven't you studied properly? Why haven't you got good marks? But today, the teacher is questioned. See, it has all become consumer driven. So the customer is always right, the consumer is always right, the student is always right. So we are questioned if the grades go wrong, if the grades are bad. So let's take a look at some of the experts who spoke about teaching learning strategies. Now, what is the goal of these teaching learning strategies? It is learner autonomy. I will explain what learner autonomy is. First, you should know the names of all these experts who have spoken a lot on teaching learning strategies. You have Joan Rubin, Hayo Reinders, Anita Wenden, Rod Ellis, Anna Al-Shamat, Rebecca Oxford. So these were great language experts. These are great language experts who have spoken a lot on learner autonomy. What exactly do you mean by learner autonomy? The aim of any teaching learning strategy, idealistically speaking, is to foster, to create a sense of learner autonomy. What exactly does this mean? Now this is Henry Holleck, and that is his definition of learner autonomy. Please note, whenever we talk about definitions in English language teaching, you have three types of definitions. One that focus on the teacher, two, those that focus on the learner, and three, that focus on the learning experience or the learning process. Now, this particular definition of Henry Holleck focuses on the learner. So what is learner autonomy? The ability to take charge of one's learning. So if the learner can manage his or her learning experience or learning process, then that becomes learner autonomy. So what is Maria Montessori's definition? Now, on looking at these definitions, both of which are focused on the learner, I want you to understand one thing. Please don't be under the misconception that learner autonomy means 100% the learners are independent and 0% the teacher is not at all involved. No, please, that is not the way you're going to look at it. Learner autonomy does not mean 100% independence on the part of the learner. That's a misconception among most practitioners and students of English language teaching. That's not the way it is. And when I say it is not 100% independence on the part of the learner, I also mean to say that this is not the definition of learner autonomy. This is the problem with most of us in the teaching fraternity. We try telling the others that we are trying to foster learner autonomy, but actually what we are doing is this, sadly speaking. So what is a strategy that fosters learner autonomy, that goes towards fostering learner autonomy? Now, this is Leslie Dickinson's definition of a strategy. What is a strategy? So, here, Dickinson talks about the learning experience or the learning process. So, it talks about the activities and the techniques which are involved in the learning process and which help in better learning, effective learning. So, this is Dickinson's definition. Now, let's take a look at another definition. Now, Rebecca Oxford's definition focuses on the learner because the focus is on learning strategies, so the focus is also on the learner. So here we are not talking about activities or techniques. She says behaviors or actions that learners use in order to make learning more effective and more enjoyable. So what is the role of the teacher? If you're talking about learner autonomy, is there the need for a teacher? Yes, of course we need the teacher. You can never do away with the teacher. The roles of the teacher may change. What is the real meaning of learner autonomy? The real meaning of learner autonomy is that the learners are given more freedom to work with the learning process. The teacher guides wherever necessary. The teacher facilitates wherever necessary. And even if the teacher is the controller, the remote control, or the kingpin, the teacher does so indirectly, unobtrusively, in a way that it is not absolutely evident to the student. Okay, the teacher is controlling me, the teacher is in charge. No. Indirectly, you do this in the teaching learning process. So that is the real meaning of learner autonomy, giving students more freedom, more space to work out their learning process, their learning experience, while you are always there at every step guiding them, though not directly, indirectly. So this is the real meaning of learner autonomy. Now, why do you need this? In the present setup, more than anything else, now you need this. Why? Why do you need this? It is part of your survival skills or our survival skills as teachers. It is not just devices, it's not just softwares that need to be updated. Our brain also needs to be updated to meet the current challenges. Only then you can relate whatever recent trends are there in technology to your classroom. You can bring in whatever you have updated yourselves with to your students. So now that I told you the definition of strategies, now that I told you what learner autonomy is, now that I've told you the names of exponents who are responsible for bringing in a lot of strategies and who are responsible for bringing in a lot of concepts related to learner autonomy, now let's move on to the strategies themselves. Now there are many who have brought in their inventory of strategies, but I prefer taking up Rebecca Oxford's inventory of strategies because it is comparatively more recent and it is comparatively more adaptable to the teaching learning process. So you find the two types of broad strategies. You have the direct strategies and the indirect strategies. So as the name itself suggests, direct strategies are those activities or techniques that directly help in the teaching learning process. Indirect strategies are those that are not directly responsible for learning but which indirectly help in the learning process. Those are related to attitudes, feelings, values, ethics, etc. Now let's talk about the direct strategies first. Now there are three broad categories. You have memory strategies, cognitive strategies, and compensation strategies. Put together, I'm not talking about each of these, put together on the whole, these three areas consist of 10 main strategies put together. These three areas consist of 10 main strategies and 35 subcategories, okay, or sub-strategies. Now, it's impossible for us to discuss all 35 sub-strategies and the 10 main strategies. I'm going to just choose strategies at random that can be applied to your classrooms at large. Now, the first strategy we're going to talk about is semantic mapping. Now, what do you mean by semantic mapping? As I have mentioned in the slide, it is the process or the act of representing ideas in the form of a diagram. A diagram could mean a table, it can be a fishbone diagram, okay, it could be, shapes connected by lines. The shapes can be oval, circular, rectangular, square, call it what you will. So this is called semantic mapping. Now, when you say semantic mapping, you're talking about a graphic organizer or a mind map. Now, what is the difference between a graphic organizer and a mind map? Please note, most of us use these terms synonymously, but please, they are not the same. They are not the same. Now, let me give you an example of a graphic organizer. Now, this, my dear friends, is an example of a graphic organizer. See, I have given them a diagrammatic representation of a framework. So according to Richards and Rogers framework, there are three aspects involved: approach, design, and procedure. Okay. Now in Martin Phillips's framework, there are 7 aspects involved. This is how I have presented it. And this is Philip Hubert's framework, which borrows from both these frameworks. Now this is part of the course Computer Assisted Language Learning, which I teach my students who are in their final year. Now, let me give you an example. Now let's say I remove this term, approach, or I remove these terms, approach, design, and procedure. And I give them this organizer, which is empty. Okay? I give them this diagram, which is empty. So my students have to fill in approach here, design here, and procedure here. So then this becomes a graphic organizer. The teacher provides the outline to the students. Number 1. This is the first point about the graphic organizer. The teacher provides the structure or the outlook to the students. Okay? Now, in most cases, graphic organizers are content-based. Be it language or be it linguistics or literature or something, they are content-based. So it is based mostly on the lecture that the teacher provides in class. So, even if I give them these 3 gaps, it is based on my lecture and it is content based. So there is heavy control involved in this graphic organizer. My students, I know, will all write approach here, they will write design here, they will write procedure here. Okay, now let's go to Martin Phillips framework. I just give them 7 gaps like this. Maybe they will put these 7 points in different orders, but these 7 points will almost be there. The order may change, but these 7 factors or these 7 characteristics are going to be there. So there is high control exercised here. You get that? So I am the one who decides. So apart from these 7 points, they are not going to write anything else. So this is what you call a graphic organizer. Now when it comes to language, when it comes to the skills, listening, speaking, reading and writing, how exactly do we go about it? I'll show you. So in a graphic organizer, as the slide says, the teacher decides the structure. In the mind map, the student creates it entirely and it is divergent. I will explain what convergent and divergent are. Now let's say in writing, I make use of this graphic organizer to help students in their writing. I make this a pre-writing task. I help them in organizing their ideas. So what am I doing here? Look at the question. Fill in details in the following graphic organizer about your best friend. Now look at the hints here. You could provide details like name, education, what he or she is studying, where he or she lives, his or her appearance, qualities, etc. Now you have 5 shapes and you have 5 details. So what am I doing? I am exercising control in terms of how many points I want, number 1, and what those points should be also. See, though I say hints, this is exactly what I want my students to provide me. So what am I doing? I am exercising high control, and please note, when you exercise high control, there is lesser learner autonomy involved. So this is an example of a graphic organizer with high control. So when I give them the structure, this is a graphic organizer. Now let's take a look at a graphic organizer with low control. And please note, one more thing. When you are giving your students a lecture and when you ask them to prepare a graphic organizer based on the points provided by you in your lecture, when your graphic organizer is lecture centered, whatever be your course, it will always be a graphic organizer with high control and lesser autonomy. Please note the point. Now, look at this. Fill in details in the following graphic organizer about the advantages of the smartphone. Now, there is control because number 1, I want only advantages. And number 2, I want only 3 advantages. I don't want more. So what happens? There is control, but regarding the advantages, students have a greater degree of freedom and autonomy. They can choose any 3 advantages which they think are absolutely important. So here there is lesser control and a slightly greater degree of learner autonomy. So what are the skills and strategies involved in semantic mapping? Number 1, you have reference skills. Now, if it is content-based, whether it is linguistics or applied linguistics or literature, students have to refer to their notes, the lecture notes, or they have to refer to their books, and then they have to come up with the points, number 1. 2, if you ask students to do the same thing in a group rather than doing it individually, then what happens? You are allowing them to develop their interpersonal skills. That is a social strategy. 3, in order to fill in graphic organizers, number 1, students must be taught the golden rule that a graphic organizer consists only of main points, the key points, and not sentences as a whole. So, finding the main idea. It is a cognitive strategy, anything which involves critical thinking. Okay, and it is a sub-skill of reading. It is a sub-skill of reading. And again, what happens? You're grouping ideas, you're associating ideas, you're elaborating on ideas. So this is again a memory strategy. And sometimes, let's say for example, instead of words, you decide to use pictures. That is using imagery. So that is also another memory strategy. So what is a concept map or a mind map or a graphic organizer? It helps you in note making. You are indulging in a process of note making where you are summarizing the main points. So that again is a cognitive strategy, a strategy that involves critical thinking, and it is a sub-skill of reading and writing. So see, we do a lot of things in class, but we don't rationalize on them. We don't see the logic behind every activity that we do. If we were to see the logic behind that, we will be better tuned in carrying out activities in class. Now look at this. Now if I just tell my students, design a mind map on the advantages of a small class, meaning a class consisting of a small strength of students. Now here I have not given any shapes. It is a general topic. Each student can choose to write his or her own main points and sub-points or whatever. He or she can choose a mind map with circles or ovals or squares, can draw connector lines or arrows or curves or whatever. So the structure or the outlook of the mind map is not decided by me. No, I haven't provided any predefined structure. That's the first point. Number two, the points vary. The number of points vary. Student A can give me 7 points. Student B gives me only 4 points. Student C gives me 11 points. So the number of points differs and the nature of points also differs. So what happens? The level of divergence is greater. It is an open-ended question. So I'm going to have a multitude of answers. And there is a greater sense of autonomy. Now, what is the difference between a convergent task and a divergent task? Now, a convergent task or an activity involves objective questions for which you have mostly one standard answer. It could be any type of objective question. Any graphic organizer which is content driven is a convergent task because you more or less have the same answer repeated. Now, in a mind map and also in a graphic organizer with lower control, in a graphic organizer with lower control and in a mind map, you have divergence. It is open-ended. And remember, when you have greater divergence, you have greater sense of autonomy. Now, this is a mistake which most of us do as teachers. Now, let's say I give my students a lecture on elements of fiction. So, in today's class, I talk to my students about the parts of a plot, okay? The components of a plot in fiction, be it short fiction or a novel. Now, immediately after the lecture, I give them this mind map or this graphic organizer. I won't call it a mind map, definitely. It's a graphic organizer. Let's say I give them this. No gaps involved. All the gaps are filled. So what happens here? Am I giving them any challenge? Am I giving them any room for thought? No, I'm not. What am I doing? I'm filling in all the gaps myself. I'm offering them no challenge. I'm spoon feeding them. So this is my mind map, which they are merely going to memorize and reproduce. So everything is in the hands of the teacher. That is why I said teaching learning strategies. To make something a memory strategy where you just memorize or reproduce, or to make something a cognitive strategy which involves a lot of thought processing. that is in the hands of the teacher. So by doing this, I am only spoon feeding my children and I am not giving any exercise to their grey matter. So see, it's high control, total control rather. I won't say high control, it's total control. The teacher designs, the teacher decides. The only advantage here, the only saving grace here is that when you give something like this to students, when you give something in a diagrammatic manner to students, it is easier than running matter. You know, when you have running matter, it is a strain to their eyes. But when you give them something like this diagrammatically, it's easier for them to retain information. That is the only advantage. Other than that, it is a very refined form of spoon feeding. So I suppose you have now understood the difference between a graphic organizer and a mind map. I suppose you now know the difference between high control, low control, total control, and convergence and divergence. I suppose I've made myself clear. Now, this strategy is something where I will not talk about at length because this is something which most of us are doing. Now, teachers who are teaching general English, particularly those teaching the language skills, you will be using a lot of this because you're applying general rules to new situations or new texts. For example, let's say you're teaching your students grammar. You're teaching them the progressive tense or the continuous tense. So, you teach them the rule first. Okay, you will have the be verb. That is am, is, are, was, were plus verb plus ing. Let's say you're teaching them past continuous. Was or were plus verb plus ing. So this is past continuous. So you're applying a rule to a sentence where you ask them to fill in blanks, gap filling exercises. So they apply these general rules to situations or texts or to exercises. So this is a cognitive strategy. You're applying rules to new situations, to unfamiliar situations or texts or exercises. So in doing so, what happens? You're recognizing formulas and patterns. Okay, you see ing, okay, continuous. Was, were, it's past. Is, are, present. Will be, future tense. So you have formulas and patterns. Okay, dear sir, salutation. Yours faithfully, yours truly, regards. It's the concluding part of the letter. So you have formulas, you have patterns. So what happens? You are applying what is learned in a new situation. So this is analyzing and reasoning, and this is a cognitive strategy. Now, here are examples from core courses, meaning linguistics and literature and of course language. Now, how can you review this? Now, mostly we review by asking them questions in class, by giving them homework in the form of fill in the blanks, true or false, choose the correct answer. But if you could use riddles or crosswords, those of you who teach content courses like linguistics or literature, please ask them riddles. Now, for example, if I'm going to teach my students, if I teach my students social linguistics, if I want them to give me an answer to a question, I always ask a riddle. I say, I am a 7-letter word. They call me to refer to different varieties of a language. What am I? My first letter is D and my last letter is T. So my students who have attended my lecture will always answer this as dialect. So riddles, you can give crosswords to your students. You can give them other meaningful activities. See, we always do this. We give them only those types of questions which are likely to be reproduced in the exam. We follow the same exam pattern when we even give them exercises in class. Let them have fun. Let them have meaningful exercises. Let them have exercises which have pictures, jokes, which have animation in them. Look, when you're giving them online exercises, for example. So give them a structured review or, an informal review like this. So this is what you can do in core courses. Now, grammar, of course. You can do the review either in pairs or in groups, whether it is core courses or language courses. Now, there is one mistake which most of us once again do: spoon feeding. We teach our students with a great deal of dedication and commitment, but sometimes we overstretch ourselves to such an extent that in trying to help our students, we only end up doing more harm. Now, let me give you an example of what I did. Now, we teach our students through, online mode, their distance learning courses. There are students who register for distance learning in our university. And as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned, distance learning means learning online. Now, students who generally register online are not as good as the regular students. They're not as proficient as the regular students. So what happens is we are forced to end up spoon feeding them. Now, this is a kind of graphic organizer with absolute control which I gave them. Okay, see, ways of remembering information for objective questions. Obviously, a memory strategy through and through. See, this is to make them remember the elements of fiction. So look at this story setting. See, this is setting, one of the elements of fiction. Story and the author. Story, point of view. The author and the works. Story, main character, other characters. And again, I'm also telling them what type of characters they are. Flat, round, everything. Conflict. The 4 types of conflict. See? So what have I done here? I have exercised absolute control. I have spoon-fed my students. Now what can I obviously do or possibly do in a regular classroom? I just give them one example of a setting and the remaining I leave for them to fill in. So what happens is then I change the whole thing from a memory strategy to a cognitive strategy. This is what I can possibly do. Now the third strategy is the compensation strategy. Now in 95% of classes, the teacher and the students resort to the mother tongue at some point or the other. In 95% of classes, switching to the mother tongue, using L1 or the native language or the first language in class. Now when I use that in the class, let's say for example, I use a few words of Arabic. I'm not very fluent in Arabic, but I can manage with a few words. Now let's say I use a few words in Arabic while explaining concepts to my students. Then it becomes a discourse strategy from my point of view. But when a student tries to communicate with me and when the student is unable to communicate using the right words from the target language or the second language, then the student resorts to his or her mother tongue in order to communicate. That becomes lexical borrowing. In social linguistics, we call it lexical borrowing. So lexical borrowing means borrowing words from the mother tongue because you don't know the equivalent word in the target language. So see how it is different for the teacher and for the student. So how much of the mother tongue should the teacher use? How much of the mother tongue should the student use? Now we all know that this particular strategy is a double-edged sword. You use too much of the mother tongue in the class. During the teaching learning process, the student will say, wow, this teacher makes the subject so clear to me. I love this teacher. But finally, when they graduate, they go about telling students, they go about telling other students, they go about telling their friends and whoever they meet, we never got a chance to learn, the target language. The teacher taught us always in the mother tongue. They failed to understand that the poor teacher had to do that only to help them learn. Now let's look at the other side of the sword. You use lesser you resort lesser to the mother tongue. The students may sometimes curse you. They may sit with a very grim expression or an unknowing, blinkish expression on their face. But finally, they will also respect you in their own sense for whatever you're doing. As long as you simplify the language, as long as you use body language and other gestures in order to communicate, then finally it is going to help you. Anyways, we face the sword as teachers. The poor teacher always faces this. But as far as possible, try minimizing the use of the mother tongue. I'm not saying don't use the mother tongue at all, no. But try minimizing it. It should be a discourse strategy used during certain occasions. Now again, using mime. Now either ways, while explaining, when I try to resort to non-verbal communication in order to explain something, it is a compensation strategy. Similarly, when the student also tries to make me understand something using non-verbal techniques like mime, that becomes a compensation strategy. Either ways, the aim is to make the listener understand the message. But when you use mime as an activity in the classroom, wow, it opens up an entire range of possibilities. Let me tell you that. My doctoral research was on exploring venues of storytelling in the language classroom. And I devoted an entire part of my research to the use of mime. Now, let me tell you, it is one of the most powerful tools or strategies in the teaching learning classroom, in the language classroom particularly. It can be one of the best activities that you can really think of. So what are the strategies involved in mime? Number one, it is a cognitive strategy. Why? Because let's say the teacher gives the students a piece of paper on which there is a particular incident or a particular event mentioned from a short story or from a novel, and the teacher wants the student to enact that. Now, the student has to translate or transcode from the verbal to the non-verbal using appropriate facial expressions, emotions, etc. So it is an effective strategy if the student is doing it single. Now, when a group of students are asked to perform the mime, then it becomes a social and effective strategy. Okay, I repeat, it is social and effective. Because you're doing it in a group, you have to coordinate with each other. You must know when one student should stop, the other student should start performing. So it involves a lot of interpersonal skills, and it also involves your facial expressions, your body language, your emotions, etc. So this is one point. Now, for the audience who's watching the mime, who has to give the answers, once again, now just as the performers or the performer, if it is single, has to transcode or translate from verbal to non-verbal, the reverse happens with the audience. They have to transcode or translate from non-verbal to verbal, and each one will use a different set of sentences, a different set of speech forms and utterances to give you the answers. So it stimulates your speaking skills. It helps you revise whatever has been taught in class. So it helps in honing, sharpening study skills. It is a review strategy. Okay? And I can even try this in class. I can ask one student to perform a mime. I can divide students into groups, and I can ask each group to provide its answers. So there it promotes writing skills. So this can be used in the language classroom. It can be used in a literature or a linguistics classroom as well. Particularly in a literature classroom, it is very effective. So this is about using mime. This is a compensation strategy which can be turned into a cognitive strategy when you use it as a classroom activity. let's deal with the indirect strategies. Now, as I told you, why do you call them indirect strategies? Because they don't help directly in the teaching learning process. They are not used inside the classroom directly during the teaching learning process. Okay? They indirectly help in the learning process. Now let's see. Now let's deal with the metacognitive strategy. Metacognitive, anything which deals with the thinking process, anything which helps in the cognition of information, anything which helps indirectly in thought processing. That is called a metacognitive strategy. Now, Rebecca Oxford deals with self-monitoring separately and organizing separately, but I have combined these two because both are interconnected. When you self-monitor and when you self-evaluate, you are indirectly organizing your teaching learning experience. So what does this metacognitive strategy do? It helps in coordinating the teaching learning process. And how do you do this? Through checklists and surveys. Now you have a feedback form at the end of the webinar. Now what happens in this feedback form? What exactly are you doing in this feedback form? Are you evaluating the presenter alone? No. In evaluating the presenter, you are also indirectly evaluating how much you have benefited or not benefited in the webinar. So it is indirectly a way of self-monitoring your teaching learning experience and in organizing your thoughts and ideas. So that is why it is a metacognitive strategy. And teachers can and should use them regularly. You must don't give them too big a checklist to take care of. Don't ask them to fill in too many surveys. Give them shorter checklists, shorter surveys at regular intervals so that they can really appreciate whatever is done to them in class. Now the sixth strategy is using music and using laughter. Now, as I told you, Oxford uses these two separately, but I have combined them. Now these are effective strategies. Now why are they effective strategies? Because they appeal to your sense of values, ethics, feelings or emotions or whatever. Now this, according to me, is one of the best warm-up activities. Why would I call it a warm-up activity? Because I believe that not necessarily should a warm-up activity always be related to the topic of your lecture. This is what the communicative approach kind of advocated in us. Okay, when you design a warm-up activity, you must make sure that this warm-up activity is related to the topic concerned. Not necessarily. Now, during the COVID period, most of us held total online classes. Now, in my online lectures, the first 5 minutes, when students logged in, I made them watch a cartoon, I made them listen to a joke, I made them listen to music, and I told them just enjoy. I just want you to start the day on a positive note. Sometimes they listen to jokes, sometimes they watch cartoons, sometimes they listen to music, and I had informal questions to ask them after that. So they were getting into the groove, and then we started our lecture. So don't always think that whatever joke you're choosing, whatever cartoon you're choosing, whatever song you're asking them to listen to should necessarily be related to their topic. Not necessarily. Not needed. So why do you need to use laughter in the classroom? You can use a joke in the classroom. You can use it as a multi-fluency activity. I'll tell you how. Now, you can leave gaps in a joke and you can ask students to fill in the gaps. Sometimes the answers that students provide may not be a joke actually, but at least they're trying their best to write or they're trying their best to speak. Now, if you're teaching online, you can choose a particular joke from a film. You can mute the audio, so that way it becomes a mime. It's a joke, so you're using laughter. So what happens? You can ask students to imagine the dialogues and write them down in groups. tell them it should not be the same dialogue which the character uses in the film. Okay, though you mute the audio, many of them might have watched the film. So you can try this in your classroom. It helps. It really helps. So it's a multi-fluency activity. You can use it for your listening skills. You can use it for speaking, writing skills. So, in any sense of the word, this really brings life into your classroom. Look, let me tell you one thing. I happened to get a forward on one of my WhatsApp groups on an interview that Shashi Tharoor held with Sudha Murthy, the wife of Narayana Murthy of Infosys. And she was recalling her experience as a computer science lecturer. She said that some of her students still kept in touch with her and they said, you're a very good teacher. I cannot remember what exactly you taught us in terms of the course, but I remember the stories you told us. Now, the same experience was shared by me in another forum. One of my students happened to be my friend on Facebook, and he told me, "Ma'am, I can never forget your lectures. I can never forget your class. I remember during the language lab hours, one of the language lab hours, you made us listen to Michael Jackson's Beat It." He did not tell me about the theoretical aspects of whatever I taught him in class. He said, "I remember you made us listen to Michael Jackson's Beat It." Why? Because this type of teaching stimulates lateral thinking. And mind you, ladies and gentlemen, mark my words please, anything that stimulates lateral thinking will always go to your long-term memory and be stored there for eternity almost. So this is very important. So when you use music, when you use laughter, choose the right ones. Be culturally aware of what might be offensive, what might be acceptable. So be careful about all this and go ahead with it. You're sure to be a raving success. Now, what do you mean by social strategies? Now, when you do something in isolation, it is a cognitive strategy. It is an affective strategy. But when you do it in a group, it is all this combined with a social strategy. So it is based on the sociocultural theory of Vygotsky. It says that human beings learn first from society or from the environment around them, and only then does their learning become individual. So they learn from society, and then societal learning or learning from a group later on turns into individual learning. So you can have participatory learning in the classroom through interaction. It can be the teacher-student interaction, it can be peer interaction, and peer interaction is always better because that promotes better learning. So I suppose this is all for today, and please note, unless we learn the rationale behind whatever we are doing, we will not be able to face our students in the proper way. Remember, we are dealing with a generation that has less attention power, that wants different ways of teaching and learning. Please note, it's not going to be very easy. So you should be able to face situations like these. Be ready for such students. And God forbid, otherwise we may have to face this situation. So I hope you all understood whatever was conveyed in the lecture, in the webinar. Thank you very much for being a part of the webinar. And I do hope you have something to take home, to take back to your classrooms. Thank you very much for being a patient audience.